Good evening, and welcome to Asia Society Texas Center. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy. At Asia Society Texas Center, we believe in the strength and beauty of diverse perspectives and stand in solidarity with all people threatened by racism and violence. We trust in the power of art, dialogue, and ideas to combat bias, and we remain dedicated to welcoming all. And we're delighted to welcome each of you to our first hybrid program, which is both with an in-person audience and a virtual audience. Tonight's program is in partnership with the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Houston on the topic of the future of US and South Korea relations. The timing for this program is perfect, as it happens to be just a few days before President Moon Jae-in's visit to Washington. President Moon will be the second head of state to visit in person with President Biden, and there will be many key issues that will be discussed, including trade, cooperation on vaccines, climate change, and security. To discuss some of these topics and the current and future state of the relationship between the two countries, we're honored to welcome our speakers for this evening. Ambassador Myung-soo Ahn is a 40-year veteran of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and currently serves as the Consul General of Korea in Houston. His diplomatic work has primarily focused on international and multilateral trade. Dr. Hans Stockton is Dean of the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Global Studies at the University of St. Thomas. His areas of academic specialization are democratization, elections, and security in contemporary Asia-Pacific. Dr. C. Young-gi is Assistant Professor and Director of Political Science at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. He has published in the areas of East Asian and comparative political thought, deliberative democracy, and race and ethnic politics. Our moderator is Randy Sim, President and founder of Satson Corporation, a commercial real estate management and development company. Randy serves as the board chair of the Korean American Society of Houston. He also serves on the board of directors of the Asia Society Texas Center. Some housekeeping items before we begin the program. May I please request that you silence your phone? Guests are requested to keep their masks on when inside the building. Please remain in your assigned seats. And upon the conclusion of the program, please maintain a safe distance while exiting the theater. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Selena. Thank you, Selena. Thank you all for joining us this evening, both in person and virtually. I'm especially excited to be the moderator today and not have this on Zoom so that I could wear pants. The timing of this evening's event couldn't be more punctual, as Selena mentioned, with President Moon visiting Washington, D.C. A week from tomorrow. We have a wonderful group of speakers here on the panel, and so we'll just jump into some of our questions. Ambassador Ahn, the most important issue of the 21st century would be the rise of China. And we have seen focus on that from both President Trump and now President Biden. Can you discuss some of the factors that have driven China's rise over the past 2 decades?
All right, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Salina, for your kind introduction. And I also look forward to next week's summit meeting between President Moon and President Biden. I really hope it will be fruitful. Well, we'll go back to that issue maybe later. Concerning the rise of China, at the end of last year, CEBR, which is a British think tank, predicted that China's GDP will exceed that of United States by 2028. Well, my first impression was that at first glance it looked plausible, but anyway, I decided to check and analyze whether this prediction is realistic or just another myth. And for the purpose, I followed the trajectory of Chinese GDP as a percentage of United States during the last 20 years. And I noticed three distinct trends during this period of 20 years. And well, the first period is 2001 until 2006. During this period, the China's GDP as percentage of United States grew from 13% to 20% in 2006. This means China bridged the gap annually by 1.4 percentage points. Well, during this period, the most important thing to note was China's accession to WTO. And in line with the terms of accession agreement, Chinese government made a sweeping overhaul of its institutions and policies to bring them into compliance with international trading system. It means China gave market forces freer rein in its economy. So that accession to WTO provided some foundation for Chinese economy to take off. So I call this period takeoff period. And then the next period, I'd call it acceleration period. And it begins from 2006 to 2014. During this period, China's GDP, as a percentage of United States, grew from 20% to as high as 60%, which means during this 8-year period, China bridged the gap by 5 percentage points annually. Where during this period, the most important event was 2008/9 global financial crisis. And the Chinese government, they implemented a $580 billion stimulus package. And I think they were very successful. They had accumulated huge debt problem during the period, but there has been no major bank crash so far, which means China has handled that global crisis very successfully. This was, I guess, provided momentum for Chinese economy to grow in an accelerating rate. Now, the third and last period is 2014 to last year, or maybe more up until now. And during this period, the China's GDP, as a percentage of United States, of course, grew from 60% to 70%, 10 percentage point only, which means annually China narrowed the gap by only 1.6 percentage point, which is big difference from 5 percentage points during the previous period. What made China's economic growth level off? I guess that's because of demographic changes happening in China. China's workforce began to decrease since 2015. And as you may remember, at the end of last month, Financial Times reported that China's population, they do census like United States every 10 years. And last year was 2020 census in China also. And Financial Times at the end of last month reported that initial population figure came less than 1.4 billion which means Chinese population began to decrease last year. And Chinese government denied that, and a couple of days ago, they announced official figure at 1,411,000,000, which means Chinese population grew actually in 2020. But even based on Chinese official statistics, it means Chinese population grew last year at its slowest. And also birth decreased by 18%. And the demography experts also pointed out that Chinese population, based on Chinese statistics, will decrease next year. So this brings me to the prediction of CEBR. Is CEBR's prediction realistic? I don't think so. Because of demographic crisis looming in China, they cannot go back to accelerated growth anymore. And for this year only, U.S. economy grew 6.4% on an annualized basis during the first quarter of this year. And economists predict that U.S. economy will grow by 7% during this year, which will be about the same as we expect Chinese economy grow this year. It means this year there will be only minimal narrowing between Chinese economy and U.S. economy. So my conclusion is that the concerns about rise of China is a little bit exaggerated. And my guess is that China will not be able to go over 80% of United States by the end of this decade, maybe. I will pay close attention to the future trajectory of Chinese economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Dr. Yi, do you have any other comments for this question?
I agree with Ambassador Ahn's analysis that China's recent rise could have been a little bit exaggerated, especially it could not be a direct threat or immediate threat to the United States and Korea alliance. I just want to add one more aspect to Ambassador Ahn's analysis on the second stage of Chinese growth, the acceleration period, because it was actually 2006. Then Chinese leader Hu Jintao started promoting very strange Confucian ideas such as peaceful rise and peaceful development. So I think the Chinese government intentionally started promoting those pretty much like Confucian and traditional ideas, and those ideas are actually also backed by another like IR theory, a new theory called Confucian peace theory. So these theorists seem to argue that East Asian society was relatively peaceful under the China's leadership until the Opium Wars. So basically they are saying that the Sino-centric order actually offered a more stable and peaceful system in East Asia. I think when they are trying to applying this kind of model to modern and current East Asian society, then that is going to be a big mistake, because so-called the East Asian tribunal order, pre-modern era, it was not based upon China's hard power like military. It was based upon soft power mostly, China's relatively better governance system, and then the really generous trade system as well, also more advanced economic system as well. So I am not sure actually China is offering that kind of soft power nowadays to other Asian, East Asian countries. Nowadays the really important soft powers would be, well, human rights, liberal democracy, and the individual rights, freedom of speech, that kind of things. And I'm not sure China is able to offer that kind of soft power. And actually, China's recent effort to expand to that region has backfired. For example, in Korea, right? China essentially waged an economic warfare against South Korea when the South Korean government decided to deploy the THAAD system. And that kind of aggression really upset a lot of Korean people at that time. And then, in recent research by the Pew Research Center, according to the Pew Research Center, the Koreans' negative view on China has skyrocketed, almost more than doubled from 2015 to 2020. Just for 5 years, Koreans' negative view on China was, in 2015, it was only 37%, but last year it was actually 76%. So China is rising economically and militarily, but I don't think that kind of rise, China's rise, has convinced other East Asian neighbors.
The next question is for Dr. Stockton. On countering China, the U.S. administration is not acting alone, but necessarily needs to partner with countries in the region, such as with the Quad, security dialogue with Japan, Australia, and India. South Korea has so far expressed reluctance to join. Why is that?
Well, my first guess at that would be that the prize, so to speak, for South Korea's kind of policy positions in the region have to do with peace on the peninsula and denuclearization of North Korea. So getting caught up into the U.S. Hegemonic struggle, or whatever we call it, with China is a distracting factor. It's a seriously distracting factor. So the South Koreans want to not only keep themselves focused, but as well as keep the Americans focused on the immediate goal in the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, to resist the American pull of South Korea into the Quad, or a Quad plus one arrangement, something like that, that would antagonize, alienate China. The South Korean economy, as everyone in the neighborhood, is highly hinged to the Chinese economy. And there's not really necessarily any particular reason that the government in South Korea will want to rock that boat. And so I think I'll talk about Joe Biden's Goldilocks policy with North Korea, but I think Seoul is also trying to maintain a Goldilocks policy to some extent, at least economically, to maintain or to prevent new animosities from forming.
Thank you, Dr. Stockton. Ambassador Ahn, is there any other comments that you'd like to add?
Well, on the question of whether Korea will join Quad or not, well, I'm not going to speculate on Korea's future decision with regard to Quad, where they'll be weighing the advantages and disadvantages of joining Quad. But well, I'd like to touch upon a broader issue, which is U.S. leadership after 4 years of Trump as president. And earlier this year, I read an article in March-April edition of Foreign Affairs, and one article caught my attention, and it was written by Jessica Matthews, who is former president of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she wrote in her article that, I quote, foreign governments understand last year's presidential election was not a repudiation of Trumpism. Having dealt with the United States that can flip unpredictably from one policy position to the opposite, the logical response for them is to hedge, avoiding major commitments, keeping the options open, even when it comes to US policies that are otherwise welcome to them, unquote. Well, having read that article, I looked for some instances which would support Jessica Matthews' view. And the first came from Brussels at the end of March, where at the time, Secretary of State Blinken was attending a NATO meeting in Brussels. And he said, maybe at an interview or something, he said that United States will not force its allies into us or them choice with China. What made Secretary Blinken feel compelled to say that? That was because European allies like France and Germany, they were looking for some strategic balance in their relations with Beijing and Washington that ensures that EU is not so closely allied with one of them that it alienates the other. And second instance came from New Zealand in April, when New Zealand broke ranks with other members of Five Eyes on the issue of human rights situation in China. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said that she is not going to take New Zealand into the kind of trade war with China that Australia finds itself facing. So these two incidents shows that the where United States stands in its leadership in international relations, and I think this is a kind of food for thought for all of us.
Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Dr. Yi, kind of shifting gears a little bit. South Korea is making its mark globally in the world of entertainment with pop groups and films such as BTS and Parasite. K-pop groups, Korean shows, and films are increasingly becoming popular in the U.S. and have been received very favorably by the American public. Is the same the case for American entertainment in South Korea? What role does entertainment play in combating the increasing rise of anti-Asian racism in the United States?
I may not be the best person to analyze the reasons why the Korean entertainment industry has been so successful globally from a business perspective or like artistic perspective. But as a political scientist, actually, I do believe that one of the reasons why this Korean pop culture has been successful and popular in the globalized world was basically Korean pop culture. Its message is not Korean per se. Actually, when I listen to a lot of BTS songs. I mean, really, I do listen to BTS songs almost every day, actually. And then when I listen to like BTS songs, I mean, I find difficult. I mean, what is Korean in those songs, right? Of course, I mean, obviously they sing the songs in Korean language, but other than that, I mean, what is so Korean in that? I think, the Korean pop industry has become so popular because of its message, its universal message. So they are singing about basically universal values and principles such as individual freedom, humanity, self-esteem, and then the justice, social justice especially. And then that is why maybe I'm not sure you heard about this, like the BTS fan club called ARMY. They have been very active in promoting social justice in the United States. So they are addressing not only just anti-Asian racism, but any kind of racism. For example, last year during the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd death, BTS decided to donate $1 million, and their fan club ARMY, they matched $1 million donation within hours. And then also the ARMY, actually they waged some sort of like cyber attack on some racists, like hashtags such as like hashtag White Lives Matter, or hashtag like All Lives Matter, something like. They actually filled all those hashtags with like seemingly endless stream of like fan camps, basically Korean pop like fan camps, something like that. So I think this kind of universal message resonates really well with the young generation globally, not only in the United States, but globally, no matter where they live. I think the American pop culture used to work that way in Korea. When I was growing up, I loved New Kids on the Block. I'm not sure you remember this like boy group, but New Kids on the Block was my favorite like boy group basically. And then when I was listening to their songs, I was not just consuming some sort of American pop culture. I was actually I was fascinated by, the American society described in their songs. Their cultures, like dynamic life, way of life, and then openness, optimism, that kind of things. And then I'm not sure if Koreans would feel that way nowadays. Of course, Korea is one of the biggest markets for American entertainment industry, but when they watch and listen to sort of like all this like negative news about United States, like as you mentioned, anti-Asian racism and police brutality, and then like armed insurrection in the capital. The United States and Korea, we are not just allies. We are not just strategic allies. We are sharing the same principles and values of liberal democracy. And then to restore, as our topic just made, we are trying to revitalize and restore, this alliance. And then to restore this alliance, we really need to make sure that we are sharing the same liberal democratic ideas.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Yi. Dr. Stockton, this is not a BTS question. So, yeah. Japan is a member of the Quad, but tensions between Japan and South Korea have run high, and the relationship has been strained as of late. Because the United States enjoys relatively positive diplomatic relations with both nations and a vested trade interest with both nations, what is the role of the U.S. in having South Korea and Japan cooperate?
Well, there are quite a few factors, one of which being clarity and some extent of predictability in U.S. foreign policy, at least for the next 3.5 years. Our relationship with Japan and South Korea has gone from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now to Biden. And so the pendulum has really swung in terms of the multilateralism of Obama to the bilateralism of Trump, from the values-driven foreign policy of Obama to this transactional, fairly values-free foreign policy of the Trump administration. Obviously, it makes our allies very uncomfortable. I think the last administration, because of its emphasis on bilateralism, damage the collective relationship we have with Japan and South Korea, as well as Japan with South Korea and the U.S., et cetera. And so I'm very optimistic when, if you look at where an American president and executive branch puts their time, which is the most valuable resource they have in the first 4 months, right? So much of it has been dedicated to reestablishing that dialogue and that relationship with both South Korea and Japan, but also to encouraging really the trilateral conversations that I very much hope will come. I was encouraged with Intelligence Services Director Pak in his communication with Japan's Prime Minister Suga just within the last 24 or so hours. And so the U.S. can do two things in particular. One, not allow itself to be drawn into those historical disputes that Japan and South Korea have with each other, and to let those two peoples resolve those issues. The Trump administration, there were a couple of times, whether it's ignorance or lack of caring, violated some of those traditional boundaries in terms of signaling somehow a preferred outcome in some way. I think that's detrimental. The second is to re-engage both powers, not necessarily through the Quad Avenue, but to get back to trade, get back to the bilateral strategic commitments we have with each other, and maintain peace and stability in the area. I think those would be great starts.
Thank you, Dr. Stockton. Yeah. Yes, Ambassador Ahn.
Okay, concerning the third party's role in making Korea and Japan get along with each other, I guess it's not easy. There's not much role for third countries, including the United States. We appreciate their efforts, but the origin of difference lies in the historical issues, and it's not easy to reconcile while there is no reconciliation. I mean, from the part of perpetrators towards victims. And okay, let me stop at this point, without going any further detail.
Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Dr. Yi, South Korea's COVID response has been praised worldwide for its extensive use of testing and contact tracing while maintaining as much normalcy as possible given the circumstances. How has South Korea been able to manage its response the way that it has? And what can the rest of the world, including the United States, learn from South Korea in this regard?
I think we all learn from our own mistakes and failures. Yes, South Korea has been recognized for its success in combating the COVID-19 pandemic because South Korea learned hard lessons a lot from the MERS pandemic in 2015. So I think the United States, I hope, will learn the lessons from this COVID-19 pandemic starting last year. So, I think the measures Korea took to contain the pandemic, they were successful in Korea, but it may not be entirely applicable to the American situation. There are some cultural differences. For example, Koreans were already familiar with like mask wearing and facial coverings because of the MERS pandemic in 2015, and then also some like toxic air pollutants from China nowadays. So that is why Korean people didn't feel any kind of like difficulty to wear masks in public areas. but Americans didn't have that kind of experience. Also, Korea was successfully contained the pandemic, and actually many business premises and then the schools and religious facilities, they actually remained open throughout the pandemic mostly because people were required to sign up at the front or install an app just in case. So if any case is reported in that location, the government was able to like notify people who were there at the time, and also track the government was also able to track, I mean, how this kind of infected person actually moves. Or so that kind of measures may backfire in the United States because of the privacy concerns. And then also, I think, I mean, Koreans and Americans have different understandings about the role of democratic governments and then the individual citizens' rights and then the responsibilities. So I think there are certain things America can learn from the Korean experience, but they may not be applicable entirely in this situation. I also want to add one more thing. Success in containing the pandemic is a great thing, but combating the pandemic is another. So ironically, because Korea has been so successful in containing the pandemic, managing the situation, the Korean government didn't feel an urgent need to develop or acquire the vaccines. So that is why, ironically speaking, Korea is way far behind in terms of the vaccination rates. So far, only 8% of Koreans have been vaccinated. On the contrary, because the United States has struggled a lot, I mean, obviously, I mean, America lost almost 600,000 people to the disease. The government's really ramped its efforts up to develop the vaccine, and then the vaccination rate is really impressive. Now, more than 46% of Americans have been vaccinated, at least one dose. So there are certain things, I mean, we can learn from each other, but at the same time, some sort of cultural differences, I mean, differences in perceptions may make some differences.
Now, I'm as the moderator, have about one or two more questions for our speakers here on our panel. But if those here in the audience would like to ask questions, if you could be thinking about them. And then for those joining us virtually, if you can put them in the Q&A section, I'll be able to get those questions shortly. Ambassador Ahn, going back to another topic I think we touched upon, how did the past administration alter the relations between South Korea and the U.S.? And how does the growing influence of China in the Pacific affect the new administration's security calculations in the region?
All right. Concerning the U.S.-Korea alliance affected by past administration's policies, well, generally speaking, Korea-U.S. alliance has seen ups and downs during the last 6-7 years of its history. For example, in 1971, President Nixon reduced the troops stationed in Korea by 20,000. And President Carter, while running for president, he pledged to withdraw U.S. forces stationed in Korea. Although he was not able to follow through with it because he failed to get re-elected. These two incidents indicate somewhat diminished strategic importance of Korea in the eyes of the United States. Well, when it comes to Trump administration, President Trump seemed to see downgrading its allies as putting America first. Well, I think it's very ironic that President Trump called into question the Korea-US alliance when actually the importance of Korea's strategic position was strengthening. Well, first because North Korea has been modernizing its nuclear and missile capability so that major cities of United States came within the range of North Korean ICBMs. And maybe more importantly, United States contest with China for the future of Asia has been escalating. Well, now the Biden administration is now in place earlier this year. And after that, our foreign minister talked over the phone with State Secretary Mr. Blinken, and they affirmed the enduring importance and strength of Korea-US alliance as linchpin for peace, security, and prosperity of the region. And as you may be aware, at the end of last month, Biden administration, they completed the comprehensive North Korea policy review, and high-ranking Biden administration officials said that U.S. is going to pursue a calibrated, practical approach towards North Korea. And I think it was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He said that U.S. policy on North Korea is not aimed at hostility, but it's aimed at solutions and ultimately achieving complete denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. And this practical approach falls in line with Korea's position that U.S. and North Korea should seek diplomatic solution to the nuclear and missile issues of North Korea and establish a peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I can say that Korea-US alliance is as strong as ever. And concerning the growing China's influence in Pacific and the United States response to it, well, about this question, Secretary of State Blinken recently said that U.S. is not going to contain China and not holding it back. But at the same time, he emphasized that the United States is upholding certain basic ideas, in particular, rules-based international system. So I believe that the concept of rules-based order will be the key in United States' response to growing assertiveness of China in the Pacific area. And I believe U.S. will be dealing with these issues in cooperation with its allies and partners.
Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Now we'll turn to questions from the audience here. If you have any, you could raise. Yes, if you could give us your name and then ask your question. Yes, we can hear you.
So my name is Chi Lee, and my question is actually to the ambassador because he actually raised the point that I was thinking already. With the strategic position that Korea is sitting on the peninsula, and the fact that it allows the U.S. to project power into the Asian region, is this not a good opportunity
Okay. You seem to separate or differentiate the denuclearization and unification of Korea. You know, it's not separable. It's intricately interrelated. You know, Korea's ultimate goal is reunification of Korean Peninsula. You know, Korea was a victim, unlike Germany, but we were both separated, divided after the World War II, and Germany was reunified 30 years ago, whereas Korea still divided. And I am one of those 10 million family members, separated family members. And my parents, they passed away without being able to visit hometown in North Korea. Anyway, the point is that reunification should go through denuclearization of North Korean of Korean Peninsula. So our position is that engage North Korea and United States so that they can solve a solution to the issue of North Korea's nuclear and missile issues. That will facilitate the peaceful reunification. I mean, first beginning with inter-Korean cooperation or economic integration. So it is not possible to separate them and approach these two issues of denuclearization and reunification separately. It is interrelated. Anyway, I guess you're right. Current situation provides Korea with a new momentum to achieve these two goals. And of course, we will actively use this opportunity to achieve our goal of reunification. And also, I look forward to, as I said, next week's summit meeting between United States and Korea. I do hope there will be some fruitful result from that meeting. I hope.
If I could chime in, the ambassador, obviously being a diplomat, used the word momentum. I'll use the word leverage. As far as South Korea's positioning vis-a-vis the U.S., you look at the new opportunities for South Korea. It's growing importance in any kind of containment policy of China in the Pacific. The semiconductor powerhouse that it is. I mean, right? We're all facing shortages in microchips these days, and so for new reasons and new ways, South Korea is ever more important. The Moon administration announced the K Semiconductor Belt project, just billions and billions of dollars that are going to be built into really fortifying South Korea's semiconductor infrastructure. I think things like that are going to give South Korea incredible momentum as well as leverage in those conversations.
Thank you. I've got a question from the virtual audience. President Biden has made it clear his climate goals are ambitious, leading a virtual climate summit with global leaders last month, including President Moon, who committed to ending state-backed financing of coal-fired power plants overseas, and also to strengthening Korea's emissions reduction commitment under the Paris Agreement. Is this a likely area for regional cooperation between Korea, Japan, and China, despite other tensions?
Well, I am of the view that in the face of global challenges like climate change, as well as pandemic, I think all the countries should join forces. And I even think that faced with existential threat to humankind posed by climate change, I mean, any country cannot afford to engage in confrontation with other. So I'm of the view that even China and the United States, they can't afford to engage in any conflict. I mean, it's about time that, all the countries should join forces in harmony and fight for, fight the climate change. So, concerning Korea, Japan, China, some area for cooperation. Of course, global issues, we should cooperate. Well, there are some other areas where they can cooperate, as I mentioned, reunification and denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. It's another area for cooperation between Korea, Japan, and China.
Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Any other questions from the live audience? Yes.
Thank you for holding this forum. The question I have is, I think there was a discussion with the growing Chinese military involvement in the Southeast Asian, the waters and so forth. U.S. was looking to Japan for possible rearmament to counter that. And I don't know how much possibility that is. And that's one question. And number two, I guess, is what would South Korean government response should U.S. look to Japan to counteract Chinese military aggression?
So the question for the virtual audience is concern for Chinese military buildup in the South China Sea, and if Japan should intervene, and how the United States can participate or help.
Well, there are two questions. First one is U.S. will encourage Chinese rearmament. Rearmament. Yeah, I understand the current Japanese government wishes to revise their constitution so that they can rearm itself again. And well, that kind of movement in Japan will raise alarm to the neighboring countries which have suffered during World War II from Japanese invasion atrocities. So your question is U.S. If U.S. encourage Japan rearmament, well, our position is clear. We are opposed to it. And second question, should U.S. look to Korea for countering China's assertiveness? That was your agenda in your question?
Well, I think the first one was whether U.S. is actually looking to rearm the Japanese army to counteract Chinese influence. And I think you just answered the second one.
Well, actually, I'm not military expert, and I guess I'm not in a position to answer your question. So may I refer it to Mr. Stockton?
Well, it would be extremely problematic for the United States to encourage remilitarization or rearmament of Japan. It would also be very difficult if the Japanese naval forces were to become involved in South China Sea, freedom of navigation activities, etc. They've got their hands full with maritime and aerial incursions in the East China Sea. They don't need to pick another fight in that regard. Now, with regard to pushback against China's 9-dash line, that claims darn near the entirety of the region, both South Korea and Japan can play a part in saying we need to reinforce what is understood about those post-World War II boundaries, that the international courts had a voice in this just 3 or 4 years ago. The Chinese chose to not listen to. So diplomatic, international norms and rules, that's where all of our allies can chime in. Now, as far as South Korea chipping in on the containment of China, and I use that from an American perspective, and no American administration is saying we're out to contain China. The language is a little more subtle than that. But again, South Korea wants to stay focused on the prize, which is the peninsular issues. And it would be counterproductive for us to put extraordinary pressure on South Korea to, quote unquote, pick a side, so to speak, at this point.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Was there a hand on this side? Sure. Yes.
Well, concerning the demographic changes, it's serious, actually. In case of Japan, its population began decreasing in 2007, during the last 15 years. And for example, last year, 2019, Japanese population decreased by 500,000. And Japan's economic growth was alarming in the eyes of United States during 1980s. At the time, Japan as number one dominated the public debate. Anyway, Japan's GDP as a percentage of, again, United States, peaked in 1995 at 73%. And as I said, their population began to decrease 2007. And years before that, their workforce began to decrease. And now Japan GDP as percentage of United States is only 24%. My point is that demographic changes, its impact is huge. And if population decreases, it will exact heavy toll on everything from consumption to cares for the elderly. So that's why I said at the beginning of this debate that because China's population will soon begin to decrease, it's not possible that Chinese GDP will someday exceed United States. That's why I said that at best it will reach only 80% of United States. In contrast to China, the population of United States is growing. As the census result showed, it grew 7.4% in comparison with 10 years ago. And another contributing factor is that United States immigrant worker population is growing. That's another bright side. According to the newspaper article, in China last year, the immigrant worker population decreased for the first time, and that's what I read on the article. So population is very important. in maintaining its economic power. Economic power is the basis of military power and also political power.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ahn. Dr. Yi?
If I may just add just one more thing. I mean, in political science, mostly the economic growth results in the large and strong middle class, and which eventually will lead to the collective yearn for democratization and individual liberty and the freedom of speech with liberal democratic ideas. And then about 10 years ago, I was reading an article in Wall Street Journal, and the title was actually the article was about the political consciousness of the Chinese middle class at that time, and the title was actually affluence, not influence. So basically, that article was saying that the Chinese middle class may not have a strong will for democratization as long as their economic well-being is guaranteed. So far, I think the Chinese regime has been pretty good at redirecting the growing number of Chinese middle class yearn like zeal for democratization, and then redirect it to their desire for economic well-being. I'm not sure how it will last. Because I mean, as we see now, I mean, the Chinese aggression in Hong Kong and other areas in East Asia, it's quite alarming actually. So we will see how the recent rise of China's economic power as well as military power will result in more peaceful order in East Asia or not. We'll have to see.
Thank you, Dr. Yi. Well, we could spend additional time on this topic, but we've run out of time. If you could please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our speakers. Thank you, Ambassador Ahn, Dr. Stockton, Dr. Yi. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Please visit us on Asia Society's website for future programs, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.